Sarah's hands trembled as she held the divorce papers. The ink was still fresh, but the marriage had been dead for months. Her husband Marcus had left her for his secretary, taking their savings and leaving her with nothing but crushing debt and a baby growing inside her belly. At 28, she found herself completely alone in the world, with nowhere to turn. The small apartment in Denver felt like a prison. Every corner reminded her of the life she thought she would have. The nursery they had started painting together now seemed like a cruel joke. The medical bills kept piling up, and her job at the insurance company barely covered rent. She needed a fresh start. Somewhere far from the memories and the whispers of neighbors who knew her story, Sarah's grandmother had always told her about. The old family land in Colorado. 100 acres of wilderness that nobody wanted. Her grandfather had won it in a poker game back in 1952, but the family had never done anything with it. It was too remote, too wild, too difficult to develop. But for Sarah, it represented something different. It represented hope. She quit her job on a Friday and loaded everything she owned into her beat-up Honda Civic. The drive to the property took her through winding mountain roads that seemed to lead to nowhere. When she finally found the rusted mailbox that marked her land, she sat in her car for a long time, staring at the endless expanse of pine trees and rocky terrain. The land was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. There was no house, no electricity, no running water. Just raw wilderness stretching as far as she could see. Most people would have turned around and driven back to civilization. But Sarah felt something she had not felt in months. She felt free. She spent her first week living in her car, studying YouTube videos on her phone whenever she could get a signal. She learned about building foundations, framing walls, and installing basic plumbing. Her pregnancy made everything harder. Morning sickness struck at the worst moments, and her growing belly made it difficult to move around. But she refused to give up. Sarah started by clearing a small area near a natural spring she discovered on the eastern edge of her property. She used a borrowed chainsaw to cut down trees, her back aching with each swing. The physical work was brutal, especially in her condition, but it felt good to build something with her own hands. Every fallen tree represented her determination to create a new life for herself and her unborn child. The local hardware store owner, Mr. Peterson, became her unlikely ally. He was skeptical at first when a pregnant city woman started buying lumber and tools. But when he saw her loading 2x4s into her little car, determination written across her face, something changed in his expression. He started giving her advice, recommending the best materials for her budget, and even delivered supplies to her property when her car could not handle the load. Sarah's days began at sunrise and ended long after dark. She worked by the light of battery-powered lanterns, measuring and cutting boards for the frame of what would become her home. Her hands developed thick calluses and her arms grew strong from hauling materials. The baby kicked constantly, as if encouraging her efforts. The foundation took her 3 weeks to complete. She mixed concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow, pouring it section by section into the forms she had built. Her back screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain. This cabin was not just shelter. It was proof that she could survive anything life threw at her. By the time the walls began to take shape, word had spread through the small mountain community about the pregnant woman building a cabin alone. Some folks drove by just to see if the stories were true. They saw Sarah, 6 months pregnant, hammering shingles onto the roof she had constructed beam by beam. Most shook their heads and drove away, convinced she would never finish. But Sarah kept working. She installed windows she bought secondhand from a demolition site. She ran electrical wire through the walls, following diagrams she had printed at the library in town. She taught herself plumbing by watching online tutorials, connecting pipes that would bring water from the spring to her kitchen sink. The cabin was small, just 800 square feet, but every inch had been built with love and desperation. Sarah painted the walls a cheerful yellow, imagining her child playing on the wooden floors she had installed herself. She built shelves for books, a kitchen table from reclaimed wood, and a rocking chair where she would nurse her baby. As autumn arrived and her due date approached, the cabin finally looked like a home. She had done the impossible. Armed with nothing but determination and YouTube videos, she had created a sanctuary in the wilderness. The accomplishment filled her with a pride she had never experienced before. Sarah stood on her front porch one evening, watching the sun set over the mountains. Her hands rested on her swollen belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside. She had proven to herself that she was stronger than she ever imagined. The divorce that had seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of something beautiful. The fire she built in her stone fireplace that night was the first in her new home. As the flames danced and crackled, Sarah felt a peace she had not known in years. She had built more than just a cabin. She had built a new version of herself, one that could face any challenge. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, but tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. Outside her windows, the Colorado wilderness stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. This land would be her child's playground, their sanctuary from the world. Sarah smiled as she felt another kick from the baby, strong and insistent. She whispered to her unborn child about the life they would build together in this place she had created with her own two hands. The morning Sarah went into labor, snow was falling hard across the Colorado mountains. She woke before dawn to contractions that took her breath away, gripping the wooden bed frame she had built with her own hands. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away on winding mountain roads that were treacherous in good weather. In a snowstorm, it might as well have been on another planet. Sarah tried to stay calm as she gathered the bag she had packed weeks ago. Her old Honda struggled to start in the cold, the engine turning over reluctantly. She had barely made it 5 miles down the mountain when the next contraction hit with such force that she had to pull over. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, radiating through her entire body like lightning. She managed to call 911 on her cell phone, but the connection was weak and kept cutting out. The dispatcher told her an ambulance was on the way, but with the storm, it could be an hour or more. Sarah looked at the swirling snow outside her car windows and realized she might have to deliver her baby right here on the side of the mountain. 20 minutes later, headlights appeared through the snow. But instead of an ambulance, a large pickup truck pulled up behind her car. A man in a cowboy hat stepped out, his boots crunching on the fresh snow as he approached her window. Sarah had never seen him before, but something about his calm presence immediately put her at ease. His name was Jake Mitchell, and he owned a ranch 10 miles down the valley. He had been driving home from checking on his cattle when he spotted her car. Jake was 35 years old, weathered by years of working outdoors, with kind eyes and steady hands that spoke of a man who had dealt with plenty of emergencies on his ranch. Jake took one look at Sarah, doubled over in pain, and knew they did not have time to wait for help. He had delivered dozens of calves over the years and had assisted when his sister gave birth to her son during a similar storm 5 years earlier. Without hesitation, he helped Sarah into the back seat of his truck, which was warmer and roomier than her compact car. The next contraction came fast and hard. Sarah gripped Jake's hand as he knelt beside the truck, his voice calm and reassuring as he talked her through each wave of pain. He had grabbed clean blankets from his truck, and his movements were confident and sure. There was something about his presence that made Sarah feel safe. Even as her body betrayed her with pain she could not control, when the baby finally came, arriving in a rush that surprised them both, Jake caught the tiny, squirming infant with the same gentle care he showed his animals. The baby was a girl, small but healthy, with a strong cry that echoed through the snowy wilderness. Jake wrapped her in his jacket and placed her on Sarah's chest, his eyes bright with wonder at the miracle he had just witnessed. The ambulance arrived 30 minutes later. But by then the crisis was over. The paramedics checked both mother and baby, pronouncing them healthy and stable. They transported Sarah and her daughter to the hospital for proper care. But Jake's quick thinking and steady hands had made all the difference. Sarah named her daughter Emma, after her grandmother who had told her stories about the family land. During the 3 days she spent in the hospital, Jake visited twice, bringing flowers from his ranch and checking to make sure they had everything they needed. He was quiet and respectful, but Sarah noticed the way his face lit up when he held Emma, as if something inside him had awakened. When Sarah returned home to her cabin, she found that Jake had been busy. He had shoveled the snow from her driveway and stacked wood by her front door. Inside, her fireplace was ready to light, and her refrigerator was stocked with groceries and casseroles from his sister Maria. A note on the kitchen table simply said, "Welcome home. Call if you need anything. Jake. The first weeks with a newborn were harder than Sarah had expected. Emma was a good baby, but she woke every few hours to nurse, and Sarah found herself exhausted beyond measure. The isolation of living alone in the mountains hit her harder now that she was responsible for another life. Some nights when Emma would not stop crying, and Sarah felt like she was losing her mind. She wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Jake seemed to sense when she needed help most. He would show up with groceries, or offer to hold Emma while Sarah took a shower, or caught a few hours of sleep. He never stayed long, respecting her independence, but his presence was a lifeline during those difficult early days. Sarah began to look forward to his visits. Finding herself watching the road for his truck, Emma was 6 weeks old, when a late spring storm knocked out power across the valley. Sarah's generator failed, and without electricity, she had no way to pump water from her well. She was heating bottles over the fire and melting snow for drinking water when Jake appeared at her door. His truck loaded with supplies and a portable generator. He stayed that night, sleeping on her couch while the storm raged outside. Sarah found herself grateful for his presence, not just for the practical help he provided, but for the comfort of knowing she was not completely alone in the world. When Emma woke crying at 2 a.m, Jake quietly got up and walked her around the cabin, humming old country songs until she fell back asleep in the morning. As they shared coffee and watched the sun rise over the mountains, Sarah realized something had changed between them. It was not just gratitude she felt toward this kind stranger who had delivered her baby and helped her through the hardest weeks of her life. It was something deeper, something that scared and thrilled her at the same time. Jake seemed to feel it too. When Emma smiled at him for the first time that morning, a real smile that lit up her tiny face, he looked at Sarah with an expression she had never seen before. It was tenderness and hope and something that might have been love, all wrapped up in the gentle way he touched Emma's cheek. Sarah's heart, which she thought had been broken beyond repair, began to beat with a rhythm she had forgotten existed. For the first time since her divorce, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included more than just survival. She imagined a future that might include love. Spring arrived in the Colorado mountains with a burst of wildflowers and rushing streams fed by melting snow. Emma was 3 months old now, a happy baby with bright eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Sarah had settled into a routine of sorts, her days filled with caring for Emma and maintaining the cabin she had built. But increasingly, her thoughts turned to Jake Mitchell and the way he looked at both her and Emma as if they were something precious. Jake's visits had become more frequent, though he always had a practical reason for stopping by. He would check the generator, bring fresh vegetables from his garden, or help with repairs around the cabin. Sarah began to realize that some of these repairs were things she could have handled herself, but she found herself looking forward to his company more than she wanted to admit. One warm afternoon in May, Jake arrived with his sister Maria and her 5-year-old son Tommy. Maria was a petite woman with Jake's same kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put Sarah at ease. She had been curious about the woman who had built a cabin while pregnant and captured her brother's attention in ways Maria had never seen before. The two women hit it off immediately. Maria admired Sarah's courage in building the cabin alone. Sarah was grateful to have another woman to talk to after months of isolation. They sat on the porch while Jake and Tommy played with Emma, who giggled and cooed at the attention. Watching Jake's gentle way with both children, Sarah felt her heart do something complicated and wonderful. Maria noticed the way her brother looked at Sarah and Emma, and later, while the men were fixing a loose board on the porch, she pulled Sarah aside. Maria told her that Jake had never been married, had never even come close. He had always said he was too busy with the ranch to set in his ways. But something about Sarah had changed him in ways Maria had never thought possible. Sarah confided her fears to Maria. She had been hurt so badly by Marcus, had her trust shattered so completely that the idea of opening her heart again terrified her. What if Jake was just being kind? What if his interest was temporary? What if she was reading too much into his gentle attention? Maria listened without judgment, understanding the courage it took for Sarah to even consider loving again. As summer arrived, Jake's visits became a natural part of Sarah and Emma's routine. He would arrive after finishing his ranch work, often bringing dinner that Maria had prepared. They would eat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Emma would fall asleep in Jake's arms, and Sarah would find herself studying his face in the soft evening light. The first time Jake kissed her, it was after Emma's first 4th of July. They had gone to the small-town celebration together, and Sarah had felt like part of a family for the first time in over a year. When they returned to the cabin that evening, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier, Jake had walked Sarah to her door. The kiss was gentle and tentative, a question rather than a demand. Sarah's answer came in the way she leaned into him, her arms finding their way around his neck. But old fears die hard. The next morning, Sarah woke filled with panic. She had sworn she would never depend on a man again, never put herself in a position to be abandoned and betrayed. When Jake arrived that afternoon, she was cool and distant, using Emma's fussy mood as an excuse to cut his visit short. Jake left confused and hurt, though he tried not to show it. Sarah spent the next few days convincing herself she had done the right thing. She was fine on her own. She did not need anyone. Emma was all the family she needed, but the cabin felt empty without Jake's presence. And even Emma seemed to look toward the road, waiting for the familiar sound of his truck. It was Maria who finally forced the issue. She arrived one morning with Tommy and a basket of fresh bread. Taking one look at Sarah's puffy eyes and determined expression, Maria had watched her brother mope around his ranch for a week, and she was not about to let stubborn pride ruin what could be a beautiful thing, Maria told Sarah the story of Jake's childhood, how their father had died when Jake was 16, leaving him to run the ranch and take care of the family. He had sacrificed his own dreams and desires to keep them all together, turning down opportunities to leave the valley because his family needed him. He had learned to be self-sufficient, to not need anyone, because needing people meant they might leave. The story hit Sarah harder than she expected. She realized that Jake's fears mirrored her own. They were both people who had been hurt by life, who had learned to build walls to protect themselves. But those walls were also keeping out the very thing they both needed most: love. That evening, Sarah walked the mile to Jake's ranch with Emma in her arms. She found him in the barn, working on a piece of equipment that clearly did not need fixing. His face when he saw her was carefully neutral, but she could see the hope he was trying to hide. Sarah had rehearsed what she would say during the walk, but when the moment came, words failed her. Instead, she simply said, "I'm scared." Jake set down his tools and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "So am I." Those 3 words broke down the wall between them more effectively than any grand romantic gesture could. Have they talked until well past midnight? Sitting in the barn with Emma, sleeping peacefully nearby, Sarah told him about Marcus, about the betrayal and abandonment that had nearly broken her. Jake told her about the woman he had loved in college who had left him for someone with bigger dreams and deeper pockets. They shared their fears about opening their hearts, about the risk of being hurt again. By the time Sarah walked home in the pre-dawn light, something fundamental had shifted between them. They had moved past the careful politeness and tentative attraction to something deeper and more honest. They had chosen to be vulnerable with each other, to risk the pain that came with loving someone. Emma gurgled happily as they walked back to the cabin, as if she approved of the night's developments. Sarah looked back once to see Jake standing in his doorway, watching them go. The expression on his face was one of wonder and gratitude, as if he could not quite believe his good fortune. Sarah felt the same way, her heart full of possibilities she had thought were lost forever. By late summer, Sarah and Jake had fallen into a comfortable rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Jake would arrive at the cabin each evening after finishing his ranch work, often finding Sarah and Emma waiting on the porch. Emma, now 6 months old, would light up at the sight of his truck, her chubby arms reaching for him before he even got out of the cab. Jake had become as essential to their daily life as sunrise and sunset. Sarah watched Jake with Emma and marveled at his patience. He would spend hours on the floor with her, building block towers for her to knock down, making funny faces that sent her into fits of giggles. When Emma was teething and cranky, Jake had a magic touch that could calm her when even Sarah could not. He never acted like caring for Emma was a burden or an obligation. He genuinely delighted in every milestone. From her first tooth to her attempts to crawl across the cabin floor, their relationship deepened slowly. Built on shared dinners and quiet conversations after Emma went to sleep, they talked about everything: their dreams, their fears, their plans for the future. Sarah told Jake about her desire to expand the cabin, maybe add a workshop where she could build furniture to sell in town. Jake shared his vision of expanding his ranch, breeding horses alongside his cattle. Their individual dreams began to weave together into something that looked surprisingly like a shared future. The first real test of their relationship came in August, when Marcus appeared at Sarah's door. She had not seen or heard from her ex-husband since the divorce was finalized. But there he was, standing on the porch of the cabin she had built, looking around with barely concealed disdain. He was dressed in an expensive suit that looked ridiculous in the mountain setting, his city shoes already dusty from the dirt road. Marcus claimed he wanted to see his daughter. Though he had shown no interest in Emma since learning of Sarah's pregnancy, he made vague threats about custody rights, suggesting that a single mother living in isolation was no fit parent. His real motivation became clear when he started asking about the property value, wondering aloud if Sarah had struck oil or found some valuable mineral rights that might be worth pursuing. Sarah stood her ground. Emma balanced on her hip, refusing to let Marcus into the home she had built. She told him that if he wanted any kind of relationship with Emma, he would need to go through lawyers and establish legal visitation. She would not be intimidated or manipulated anymore. Marcus's face turned ugly when he realized his power over her was gone. But before he could say anything more threatening, Jake's truck pulled into the driveway. Jake took in the situation at a glance. Sarah's protective stance, the strange man in the expensive suit, the tension crackling in the air. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, but Sarah could see the steel in his eyes. Marcus immediately began posturing, making it clear that he was Emma's father and had rights that superseded any claim Jake might have. Jake did not rise to the bait. Instead, he simply stood beside Sarah, close enough that his presence was unmistakably protective, but not so close as to crowd her or suggest she could not handle the situation herself. When Marcus demanded to know who Jake thought he was, Jake's answer was simple and direct. He was the man who loved Sarah and Emma, and he would not allow anyone to threaten or intimidate them. The confrontation ended when Sarah threatened to call the sheriff. Marcus left with angry words about lawyers and custody battles, but his threats felt hollow. He had expected to find Sarah broken and desperate, easy to manipulate. Instead, he found a woman who had built a life of her own choosing, surrounded by people who loved and supported her. His power over her was gone, and they both knew it. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah and Jake sat on the porch talking about what Marcus's appearance might mean. Sarah was worried about legal battles she could not afford, about the possibility that a court might decide Emma would be better off with her father's money and city advantages. Jake listened to her fears without trying to dismiss them, but he also reminded her of her strength. He pointed out everything she had accomplished: building a home with her own hands, creating a safe and loving environment for Emma, establishing herself in the community. Any judge would see that Emma was thriving in Sarah's care, and if Marcus wanted a legal battle, he would find himself facing not just Sarah, but an entire community that had come to respect and admire her. Jake's faith in her helped calm Sarah's fears, but it was his next words that truly surprised her. He told her that if she would have him, he wanted to be Emma's father in every way that mattered. Not to replace Marcus or compete with him, but to be the dad Emma deserved. He wanted to be there for first steps and first words, for scraped knees and bedtime stories. He wanted to teach her to ride horses and help with homework and walk her down the aisle someday. Sarah had not realized how much she had wanted to hear those words until Jake spoke them. Emma already adored Jake, and he had been more of a father to her in 6 months than Marcus had ever been. But hearing Jake commit to that role, seeing the love and determination in his eyes, made Sarah's heart swell with emotion she could barely contain there. Kiss that night was different from any they had shared before. It was not just passion or affection, but a promise, a commitment to face whatever came together as a family. When they broke apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he loved them both more than he ever thought possible. Sarah realized that somewhere along the way, without her even noticing, Jake had become home to her in a way that had nothing to do with buildings or property lines. Home was wherever he was, wherever the three of them were together. The cabin she had built was just walls and a roof. The real foundation of her new life was the love she shared with Jake and the family they were creating. Together, the next morning brought news that would test that foundation. Maria arrived early with word that Marcus had been asking questions in town, trying to find out about Jake's finances and reputation. He was clearly building a case to challenge Sarah's fitness as a mother, and Jake's involvement would likely be part of his strategy. The legal battle Sarah had feared was about to begin, and it would determine not just Emma's future, but the future of the family they had all come to cherish. The custody battle that Marcus initiated turned Sarah's peaceful mountain life upside down. Legal papers arrived by certified mail, filled with accusations that made Sarah's blood boil. Marcus painted her as an unfit mother, living in poverty and isolation, dependent on the charity of strangers. He claimed that Emma deserved the stability and opportunities that only his wealth and city connections could provide. Sarah hired the only lawyer she could afford, a young woman named Jennifer Torres, who had recently opened her practice in town. Jennifer was smart and determined, but she was honest about the challenges they faced. Marcus had money and resources, and family court judges often favored biological fathers who could provide material advantages. Their best hope was to demonstrate that Emma was thriving in Sarah's care and that removing her would cause more harm than good. The stress of the legal proceedings began to take its toll on everyone. Sarah found herself documenting every aspect of Emma's care, keeping detailed records of her development and daily activities. She lay awake at night worrying about court dates and depositions, about the possibility that some judge might decide she was not good enough to keep her own daughter. Jake felt the strain too, though he tried to hide it for Sarah's benefit. Marcus's lawyers had made it clear that Jake's relationship with Sarah and Emma would be scrutinized closely. They portrayed him as a drifter and opportunist, suggesting that his interest in Sarah was motivated by the value of her property rather than genuine affection. The accusations stung because Jake knew how hard he had worked to gain Sarah's trust. The worst moment came when Child Protective Services showed up at the cabin for an unannounced inspection. Sarah had been expecting something like this, but seeing the official car in her driveway still made her hands shake. The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson, walked through the cabin with a clipboard, noting everything from the safety latches on the cabinets to the cleanliness of Emma's high chair. Emma, who had always been a happy and social baby, seemed to sense the tension in the air. She clung to Sarah throughout the visit, refusing to smile or interact with the stranger who was there to judge whether they belonged together. Mrs. Patterson's expression remained professionally neutral, but Sarah caught her making notes about Emma's apparent anxiety around new people. Jake had stayed away during the inspection at Jennifer's advice, but he arrived shortly after Mrs. Patterson left. He found Sarah sitting on the porch steps, holding Emma and crying tears of frustration and fear. The cabin that had once been her sanctuary now felt like evidence in a case against her. Every choice she had made, from building in isolation to accepting Jake's help, was being twisted into proof of her inadequacy. That evening, the three of them sat in the cabin's main room, Emma playing with wooden blocks on the floor between them. Jake and Sarah talked quietly about worst-case scenarios and backup plans. If the court ruled against her, would Sarah try to run? Could they disappear together, start over somewhere else? The conversation felt surreal, planning a life as fugitives because Sarah had dared to build a home and fall in love. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tom Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's husband and a longtime resident of the valley, had been watching the situation unfold with growing indignation. He had known Jake since childhood and had watched Sarah build her cabin with nothing but determination and borrowed tools. When he learned that his wife had been assigned to investigate Sarah, he decided to speak up. Tom told Mrs. Patterson about Jake's reputation in the community, how he had saved the Johnson Ranch from bankruptcy by helping with their cattle drive, how he had organized volunteers to rebuild the Martinez family's barn after the fire. He explained how Sarah had impressed everyone with her grit and resourcefulness, how she had become part of the community despite living in relative isolation. Mrs. Patterson's second visit to the cabin was different from the first. This time, she came not as an investigator but as someone genuinely trying to understand Emma's living situation. She saw how Emma lit up when Jake arrived, how naturally he stepped into the routine of bath time and bedtime stories. She watched Sarah and Jake work together to care for Emma, their movements synchronized like partners who had been together for years. Rather than months, the social worker also spoke with neighbors and community members who had interacted with Sarah and Emma. Dr. Martinez, who had treated Emma for a minor ear infection, spoke glowing about Sarah's attentiveness as a mother and her commitment to Emma's health and development. The librarian in town mentioned how Sarah brought Emma to story time every week, and how the baby was clearly loved and well-cared-for. Most importantly, Mrs. Patterson observed Emma herself. Away from the stress of that first visit, Emma showed her true personality, curious, happy, and securely attached to both Sarah and Jake. She crawled confidently around the cabin, exploring her environment with the fearlessness of a child who had never known anything but love and safety. When she tumbled and scraped her knee, she ran to Sarah for comfort, but accepted soothing from Jake just as readily. The court hearing was scheduled for a cold day in November, just as the first snow was beginning to dust the mountain peaks. Sarah dressed in her best clothes, a simple blue dress that she had worn to her job interviews back in Denver. She looked around the cabin one more time before leaving, memorizing details in case this was the last morning she would wake up there with Emma. Jake drove them to the courthouse, his jaw tight with tension, but his hands steady and warm when Sarah reached for it. Emma babbled happily from her car seat, unaware that this day would determine whether the three of them would remain a family. At the courthouse, they met Jennifer, who had prepared as thoroughly as possible, but warned them that custody cases could be unpredictable. Marcus was there with his expensive lawyers, looking confident and well-rested. He had brought photographs of his Denver penthouse and financial statements showing his substantial income. His legal team had prepared a presentation about the advantages Emma would have living with her father, private schools, cultural opportunities, medical care, and social connections that would serve her well in life. But when Mrs. Patterson took the stand to present her findings, the atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. She spoke about the loving home Sarah had created, about Emma's obvious happiness and healthy development. She described Jake not as an opportunist, but as a devoted parental figure who had stepped up to help raise a child who was not biologically his own. The judge, an older woman who had spent decades dealing with family disputes, listened carefully to all the testimony. When she finally spoke, her words were measured but clear. Emma was a thriving, well-adjusted baby who was clearly bonded to her mother and to Jake. While Marcus had the right to pursue a relationship with his daughter, there was no evidence that removing Emma from Sarah's care would be in the child's best interest. The custody remained with Sarah, though Marcus was granted supervised visitation rights if he chose to pursue them. As they left the courthouse, Sarah felt as if she could breathe freely for the first time in months. Emma would stay with them, and their little family would remain intact. The legal battle was over, but the real victory was just beginning. 2 years after the custody battle, Sarah stood on the porch of her expanded cabin, watching Emma chase chickens around the yard while Jake repaired the fence that would soon contain their first horses. The legal victory had been just the beginning of the life they had built together. Marcus had never pursued his visitation rights, disappearing back into his Denver life as quickly as he had appeared. Emma had Jake's last name now, through legal adoption, and called him Daddy with all the joy and trust that word implied. The cabin had grown, along with their family. Jake had helped. Sarah had 2 more rooms and a proper workshop where she crafted furniture that sold in galleries as far away as Denver. Her pieces were sought after by people who appreciated the story behind them. Furniture built by the woman who had constructed her own home while pregnant, who had chosen independence over security and found both in the end. Sarah's furniture business had become successful enough that she employed 2 part-time assistants from town, young women who came to learn woodworking and stayed to become friends. The isolation that had once defined her mountain life had given way to a different kind of community, one centered around the home she and Jake had created together. Emma was walking now, toddling around the property with the confidence of a child who knew every tree and rock. She had Jake's patient nature and Sarah's determined spirit, along with a fearlessness that came from being raised by people who had overcome their own fears to find love. She helped Jake feed the animals and followed Sarah around the workshop, her small hands always reaching to help with whatever project was underway. The horses had been Jake's idea, a way to expand his ranching operation while creating something Emma could grow up with. They had started with 2 gentle mares, both rescued from situations where they had been neglected or abandoned. Sarah saw something poetic in giving broken creatures a second chance. Just as she and Jake had given each other a second chance at love, spring brought a wedding that the entire valley had been anticipating. Sarah and Jake had talked about marriage many times, but they had wanted to wait until the legal battles were behind them and Emma was old enough to understand what was happening. The ceremony took place in the meadow behind their cabin, with wildflowers blooming as far as the eye could see and the Colorado mountains standing witness to their vows. Emma, now 2.5, served as the flower girl, though she was more interested in eating the petals than scattering them. She wore a white dress that Sarah had sewn herself, and tiny cowboy boots that Jake had special ordered from a craftsman in Montana. When the minister asked who gave Sarah in marriage, Emma shouted, "Daddy!" with such enthusiasm that the entire gathering dissolved into laughter. Maria served as maid of honor, tears streaming down her face as she watched her brother marry the woman who had brought such joy into his life. Tom Patterson, the man whose intervention had helped save Emma, walked Sarah down the aisle in place of the father she had lost years earlier. The wedding was simple but perfect, filled with people who had watched their love story unfold and celebrated its happy continuation. Their honeymoon was a weekend camping trip to a lake 20 miles deeper into the mountains, with Emma along because none of them could imagine being apart. They fished and told stories around the campfire, Emma falling asleep in Jake's lap while Sarah played guitar songs she had learned from YouTube during those first lonely months in the cabin. It was not the exotic getaway that other couples might choose, but it was perfectly them. The years that followed brought the kind of steady happiness that Sarah had never dared to dream of during those dark days after her divorce. Emma started school in town, riding the bus down the mountain each morning and returning each afternoon with stories about friends and teachers and playground adventures. Sarah and Jake talked about having more children, but they also acknowledged that their family felt complete as it was. Sarah's business continued to grow, and she began teaching woodworking classes for women who wanted to learn practical skills. Many of her students were going through their own difficult transitions: divorces, job losses, deaths of spouses. Sarah found deep satisfaction in teaching them that they could build things with their own hands, that they were stronger and more capable than they realized. Jake's ranch prospered too. Though he remained selective about expansion, he preferred quality over quantity, raising cattle and horses that were known throughout the region for their health and temperament. Emma learned to ride almost before she could walk properly, developing the same natural instinct with animals that had made Jake successful. The cabin itself had become something of a local landmark. Tourists driving through the valley would sometimes stop to take pictures of the house that the pregnant woman had built alone. Sarah had mixed feelings about the attention, but she understood the power of the story. It represented something that people needed to believe in, the idea that you could start over, that you could build a new life with nothing but determination and faith in yourself. On quiet evenings, after Emma was asleep and the work was done, Sarah and Jake would sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. They would talk about their days, their plans, their gratitude for the life they had built together. Sometimes they would remember those early days when everything was uncertain, when love seemed like a luxury they could not afford. Emma was 5 years old when she asked Sarah to tell her the story of how she came to live in the mountains. Sarah had been dreading this conversation, unsure how to explain divorce and abandonment to a child who had known nothing but love and security. But as she told the story, She realized it was not a sad tale, but a triumphant one. She told Emma about building the cabin, about Jake delivering her in the snowstorm, about the legal battle that had tried to separate them, but ultimately made their family stronger. She explained that sometimes people have to go through difficult times to find their way to the good times, that the struggles make the happiness more precious. Emma listened with wide eyes, then asked if she could see the pictures of Sarah building the cabin. They spent the evening looking through photo albums, marveling at images of her mother pregnant and working with tools, of the cabin taking shape board by board. The final picture showed Sarah holding newborn Emma in Jake's truck, all three of them snow-covered but smiling as Emma grew older. She would often tell people that her mom built their house and her dad delivered her during a blizzard, as if these were the most natural things in the world. To her, they were simply the foundation of her family's story, no more remarkable than other children's tales of how their parents met. But Sarah never forgot, though, magnitude of what they had accomplished. She had built more than a cabin in those desperate months when she was pregnant and alone. She had built a new version of herself, one capable of love and trust and partnership. Jake had found the courage to open his heart to a ready-made family, becoming the father Emma needed and the husband Sarah had never dared to hope for. The fire that Marcus had once seen in Sarah's eyes had never dimmed, but it had transformed from the fierce flame of survival into the steady warmth of a woman who had found her place in the world. Every sunset from their porch, every family dinner around the table Jake had built, every night they fell asleep in each other's arms, was a testament to the power of second chances and the courage to believe in love. Again, their story became part of the valley's folklore, told and retold by neighbors who had witnessed the transformation of a broken woman into the heart of a thriving family. But for Sarah, Jake, and Emma, it was simply home, a place built by hand and heart, where love had taken root and flourished like wildflowers in mountain soil.